Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Goblin and the Green Knight mini lecture to substitute for our February 3rd, 2014 English 243 class. So, you'll see my clip art attempt at reproducing some of the symbols of the text, and then we will look at some more traditional and famous images when we are back together. So, a little bit of background on Gawain. As we've talked about, this is one of those manuscripts that, at least to date, is anonymous. We can't really point at any historical person and say, there's our author. So, the best research suggests that Gawain was written circa 1375 to 1400, late 14th century, somewhat contemporaneous with the age of Chaucer. And the antique copy of Gawain that exists is in a very famous manuscript called the Cotton Nero manuscript, and it is along with three other long allegorical narrative poems called Pearl, Patience, and Purity, or Purity is sometimes called Cleanness. And these are religious allegories, and they are believed to be by the same writer based on dialect and based on symmetrical analysis and those kinds of things. So you'll hear the Gawain poet or the Pearl poet, and that's referring to this same anonymous poet. And they are written in a rural English dialect, but written by somebody who seems to have some kind of finger on the pulse of London. So you're removed from London, but there is attention to those central concerns of court and of society. And this is at the end of the age of knights on horseback. We'll see a lot of that theme running through this late 14th century, that there's a nostalgia beginning to set in. There's a romanticizing of the age of chivalry setting in. And of course, here in Gawain, we have multiple plots. We have the beheading contest, we have temptation, we have the presence of a figure who seems to represent that traditional agricultural image of the green man, and of course represents so much else besides. And we do have satire going on here. We can laugh at our characters sometimes, and we are certainly encouraged to question some of the social norms they follow. We also, of course, have Christian inspiration happening here. It's even more overt than in Beowulf. I'm sure you saw that intention on grafting a Christian message and a Christian interpretation onto this kind of a tale. But it's also a bit of an idealized vision of society. This is a civilization where hopefully things and your standing can be determined by your manners, by your brains, by your graces, how you perform. That it's not only military might. Military might, as we see, is necessary to this society, but it's not the be-all and end-all. We're trying to move past and complicate from that Anglo-Saxon era of tribal and kinship group warfare. And we're really set here in the first youthful glory of Arthur's court. That's where we start our story. That's where Gawain sets out from. And the notion of cycles is very important in this story. We see various cycles of history. We see the cycles of the 4 seasons, and not coincidentally, the church calendar receiving a lot of emphasis here. Different generations, and certainly individual lives, particularly Gawain. And our Gawain poet, like our Beowulf poet, is somebody who values old traditions and values older language forms. So we see this attempt to inject the new Christian consciousness and some of the newer social traditions, but we also see this respect for traditional elements. You see that alliterative verse, which a lot of the recent poetry translations have been very conscientious in reproducing. And then you see that bob and wheel structure. It's a very distinctive structure, that 2 syllables and then the set of short lines at the end of a lot of the stanzas that comments on the stanza and gives us the takeaway message for the stanza. And again, our writer is trying to blend this with some new perspectives on both the art and its material. And as I mentioned in class, we really see the symbolism of alchemy here. And we could take a whole course on the history of alchemy, but for a thumbnail introduction, alchemy, of course, was in many ways the basis of modern chemistry, or certainly a base of modern chemistry. And we tend to think of wizards and trying to turn lead into gold, and there were certainly charlatans and con men who pretended to be alchemists, but at its center, it has some scientific principles involved with it, the idea you can transform one kind of material into another. But it also has highly philosophical, highly personal, highly religious, and spiritual connotations. It becomes a very important metaphor. So that first stage, the nigretto, is the black, the unclean. It's starting with your lump of lead, starting with your unsaved person, starting with an immature person. And then the albedo stage, once heat has been applied, once pressure has been applied, once different chemicals have interacted, you get this beginning of a change. You get this start of purification. But it's only the second stage. We tend in our culture sometimes to associate white with purity, but there is more to go in the alchemical tradition. The citrinitas stage is gold or yellow, sometimes also yellow-green, interesting in the light of our current text. That famous idea of lead into gold, this is the third stage. This is where you produce the gold. This is where some sort of transformation has happened. But the highest stage of alchemy is the rubetto, the red stage, where the philosopher's stone or the philosophical orphan is created. And it's not just this production of gold, but this higher idea of transformation, that this philosopher's stone could create the elixir, and that, again, on a metaphorical level, some sort of deeper experience, long-lasting transformation could come out of this. And these colors, you are probably realizing, we see a lot. And they've become universal symbols of alchemy. Just in the interest of time here, I'm going to share two quick examples. You see the alchemical images and the court images and the color scheme on standard packs of playing cards. The king and the queen and the knave have various roles as well, but it's also black, white, red, and yellow. And J.K. Rowling has been very open about the fact that she did a lot of research into alchemy to set up the parameters for her magical world. And if you look at the different stages of purification of our characters, or their stages along their spiritual journey, you have Sirius Black, who struggles, and then you have Albus Dumbledore, who also is along the road to purification, but as we find out, has a ways to go. And then you have gold. You have that red and gold Gryffindor banner. And then, of course, you have Rubeus Hagrid. Notice from the beginning of the story, he's someone who is a morally fully realized and fully mature character. And we see that play out throughout the saga. And again, I'm sure you can think of other examples. Now that you've been introduced, you will see it everywhere. So in part one, we have that celebration of Arthur and Guinevere and of their court, and we have various symbolisms associated with the green. Of course, we think of green as spring, new life, youth, but then also jealousy, all sorts of things. And we see the importance of courtesy, and we see the Green Knight coming and giving this challenge. If the challenge is made in the proper way, it must be responded to in the proper way. And of course, it's made to Arthur, but Gawain gets up and volunteers instead. And the text kind of leaves it open. Is he volunteering for the right reasons or not quite? And of course, we see here that Gawain is brave, and then we see that the Green Knight, who can take off his head and keep talking, is unnatural or perhaps supernatural. We know that we are not simply dealing with another courtier, we are dealing with something capital O other. We may be dealing with an incarnation of the green man, that traditional agricultural image, that nature spirit, or we may be dealing with something else altogether, but we're dealing with something out of our world. And then in part two, as Gawain sets out on his journey, you get that emphasis on the life and seasonal cycles, and you get the continuing baptism of the hero story. You notice how parts of this almost read like a sermon. And then you get that continuing conflict with birth versus deeds and character. What is going to determine your status in this world? And that's still an open question. And then we see again the emphasis on oaths, homage, duty. Of course, the whole reason Gawain is setting out on this mad quest that may almost certainly end in his death is that he made an oath. And then in part two, of course, you get the most famous symbol in the entire text, Gawain's pentangle. Notice it's red and gold. You get those two highest alchemical colors, those highest ideals he is aiming for. And you get that long passage about the 5 fives that represent the idealism of Gawain, his 5 senses that are so good, his 5 fingers that have always done good deeds, the 5 wounds of Christ, the traditional stigmata, the 5 joys of Mary, finding out she's going to be the mother of Christ, the birth of Christ, Christ's resurrection, his ascension, and then her own assumption into heaven. And then the 5 virtues of knights that we are told Gawain displays, or is aiming to display, that he is very much this interesting combination of an exemplar, but yet somebody who is still striving for transformation. And then in part 3, we get the temptation plot. At Bertilac's court, we have turned the corner. We know we are almost to the lair of the Green Knight. And much like Christ, who is tempted 3 times, who spends 3 days in the grave, Jonah spends 3 days in the whale, Lazarus spends 3 days in the grave. There's, of course, a huge amount of biblical parallels here. Gawain is tempted 3 times. And you want to notice the progression from the level and tactics of temptation he's receiving from Bertilac's wife and the animals he hunts. The animals are increasingly challenging and dangerous to hunt, and the temptation that she offers is increasingly difficult to resist. And I don't want to foreclose any interpretations, but traditionally the deer is kind of looked at as innocence, the boar is looked at as strength, and the fox is looked at as cunning or deception. But again, there's a wealth of material there and a wealth of intersections between the hunting expeditions and the temptations that I want you to consider. And then, of course, part 4, we are confronted again with the ultimate impossibility of the challenge. And then we get this huge reveal that Bertilac is the Green Knight. That he was all this time a priest judge who was there to deem Gawain worthy. Notice, of course, the Christian component here, that even though he's made this mistake, even though he's been imperfect, Gawain is deemed worthy. That Bertilac set up this trick in order for Gawain to prove himself. And that the test was not only what it seems to be, that yes, he had to fulfill this oath to go out and meet the Green Knight, but the test was also what he encountered along the way. And then we conclude with these other layers of legend, that Morgan Le Fay is testing Arthur by testing one of his knights. And then, as we saw at the very beginning of the poem, we see here at the very end the references to Brutus and Troy and that mythologized history for England. So, much more than what it seems. Many layers of story and many layers of reference going on here. And so these are the highlights of the background of Gawain that I hope you will keep in mind as you go back and read again and as you go and do the discussion board. Of course, if you would like the 5 points of extra credit to have throughout the semester and apply to an assignment of your choice, go into the course Blackboard site. You will find an imaginatively named February the 3rd, 2014 button. You'll click on the discussion board, follow the instructions, and go from there. And of course, you can go back through this video, you can pause it at various times, you can listen to things again if you want to review particular elements. You can certainly email me with questions. Again, as you see, make sure to complete everything by 11:59 p.m. Tuesday. Make sure you're done before class on Wednesday. And I look forward to seeing everyone back in class on Wednesday.